Hello, class. Thanks for tuning in to check out this kind of video lecture about the Graeber essays. There are two of them, which I would like for you to include in your final essay for the class. So today, what I'm going to do is much like I did with David Foster Wallace, is just guide you through some of the main points, the main arguments, direct you to specific passages that you can use on the paper, the final paper, so that you can have a good broad general understanding of these essays, for the final project. And maybe I can take this opportunity to discuss that final paper. I've mentioned it a couple times in the past video lecture that I gave. Mainly, each paper for the class is structurally the same. The C.S. Lewis paper, the David Foster Wallace paper, and this paper. You are focusing, you're focusing on some aspect of these essays that relate to both to David Foster Wallace. You do not need to bring Lewis into this final paper, actually. So what you're really doing is you're trying to see where David Foster Wallace and Graeber meet, okay? And then, much like you did in the past papers, you're either extending and extrapolating and agreeing and adding to the argument, drawing your own conclusions, or maybe you're refuting some aspect of the argument, some point that they're making. Excuse me, allergies. Or you're doing both. The important thing is, and I think you guys really, for the most part, nailed it on the David Foster Wallace papers. You're coming up with a specific thesis, okay? Specific conclusions that you write as a thesis with the pieces of support that you develop through the rest of the paper. In some ways, this paper is easy in that there's a lot to write about, a lot of different directions you can go, and you're bringing in, some of these outside sources to flesh out, the paper. I think maybe the hardest part is just kind of coming to terms with some of the Graeber stuff, and then deciding what you want to write about and where you're going to make the connections between David Foster Wallace and Graeber. And I'll say really quick that, and I think some of you kind of are intuiting this, but, power and profit, okay? So, where do these, that's one way of doing it. You don't have to do it this way, but I'm saying that the easy connections that I see between the two have to do with how we are subjected to forces, bureaucratic forces, economic forces that attempt to manipulate us and control us in ways that serve those in power and serve those who want to profit from us, from what we do, the choices that we make, the things that we buy, etc. Okay, so that's one way of doing that. And as I've suggested over the course of the semester, especially in the beginning of the semester when we were in class together, think of it in terms of different passages dialoguing with one another. Taking a specific passage from David Foster Wallace, contrasting it or mashing it together, or seeing how it plays with certain passages from Graeber. And so by the end of this hour, I'm not sure how long it's going to take me, probably about 30, 40 minutes, you should have some really good passages, if you haven't already come up with your own, that can do that work. Okay? And so, kind of logistically, we'll look at having the rough draft of this paper due, on Friday, although I'm really tempted to make this rough draft optional. In fact, I think I'll just go ahead and say that what we'll do is, if you want feedback from your peers, you can post your rough draft on Friday. If you um, and just post the final draft. I'll post this in the announcement as well. However, you will be required to make 2 peer posts either way. So I'll post that in the announcement along with this link. So yeah. And then please, over the course of this week, if you have questions, I think I'm pretty much caught up on all the questions now for this class. Feel free to ask me questions about the paper. Or if you have a working thesis statement that you want to send me, please do that. But if you send me a paper, 2 or 3 days, before the rough draft is due, I'm just not going to have time to take a good look at it. If you want to send me an introduction or a working thesis, I can definitely take a look at that and tell you where you're going, if you're on the right track, okay? So let's go ahead and dig into this. The book here, The Utopia of Rules by David Graeber. Let's see, most of the times I teach this, for me it's kind of surprising that David Foster Wallace ends up being more kind of well-liked than the Graeber stuff. And I think most of that has to do with, and I think it's fair, most of that has to do with the fact that Graeber brings in a lot of stuff. And there's no humor involved. David Foster Wallace is fun to read. Graeber is a little bit tougher to get through. However, I think once you understand some of the foundational concepts for the Graeber, it unveils itself pretty well. There's no secrets there. It's pretty straightforward. So that's what I want to do right now, is kind of make those essays straightforward for you. What I'm going to do is the first essay, the introductory essay, is the most important. It does a lot of the work of the later essays. So I'm going to focus most of the time on that. Then I'm going to touch on certain passages of the second essay to kind of help you get there with understanding what's being said. But the second essay essentially has a pretty straightforward thesis and argument. So, as I do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to specific passages in this. I'm going to note those passages. I'm going to talk through those. So if you can take notes, just as you would if we were in class together, that will just help you for your final paper as you write it. So if you couldn't tell, this is a critique of bureaucracy, of what Graeber calls the era of total bureaucratization. So to really understand what's going on here, we have to understand what he means by bureaucracy and why bureaucracy is bad, and how we might define total bureaucratization. All right, so there's a lot of good stuff in here. What I like about Graeber is he seems to be very well read. For example, he opens the essay with Kafka. Some of you who are very good readers will note that he brings up David Foster Wallace, as well as a lot of other literary fiction writers who address these problems of bureaucracy. And so, on page 4, he says, bureaucracy has become the water in which we swim. On page 5, he says that we no longer like to think about bureaucracy, yet it informs every aspect of our existence. Okay? He's saying that this thing that is so pervasive in our lives has become invisible. We don't think about it or talk about it anymore. Why is that? And why is that bad, right? It's akin to this idea of looking behind the curtain. There's something behind that curtain that's influencing us daily, yet we choose to ignore it, or it's hidden from us, okay? And so the idea here is to pull aside the curtain and look behind it and see what machines back there are in operation and how they're affecting how we do our daily lives. All of you as Clemson students deal with bureaucracy daily, right, in ways that are worse than the normal person, right? Being involved and a part of working for, being a student at a university is a daily exercise in navigating bureaucracy, especially at a big state school. I went to Ohio State. I had to learn how to navigate the bureaucracy, as you do at Clemson, as state school students as well. So, the beginning part of this essay is Graeber's attempt to establish exigency, right? Why is it important for us to understand what this thing called bureaucracy is, and why should we care? All right, so let's go to this bit where he talks about total bureaucratization. That's on page 18. Okay, this is kind of one of the key, the key concepts. Up until that point, he's making kind of a little history of what was supposed to have happened, and really what was supposed to have happened in American politics and economics was that this idea of liberalism, which is closely linked to our civil liberties, and this thing called the free market, was supposed to create almost like a utopian society where the individual, where we were, would be able to pursue our interests, to pursue happiness in a society where you could work freely, you could get a job, you could be creative, you could develop yourself personally, and do good work that benefited the society at large. Okay, that was what was supposed to have happened with this idea of liberalism and the free market, but something happened, and this also has to do with democracy. The idea of having a democratic government was supposed to prevent bureaucracy, prevent the aristocracy, prevent the privileged elite from taking control. But something happened. What happened? What happened? And part of it is on page 17, where he's talking about this idea of deregulation. And that's a really good passage if you look at where it starts. So what are people actually referring to when they talk about deregulation? Well, deregulation creates more regulation. And if you understand the mechanics of that, you can begin to understand how bureaucracies begin to form. Okay, so the bureaucracies, the bureaucrats, those who are in control and begin to kind of operate these systems and create them, argue that they're doing a kind of good, but ends up they're doing a kind of evil. We're going to just make it black and white. Okay, and this kind of grows to this point where you have this thing called total bureaucratization. And so, if you look at, page 18, he coins the term. He's like, I'm going to make up a name. I'm going to call this the age of total bureaucratization. Okay? And then on page 21, he begins to kind of define what that means. So let's just note that on the top of page 18, there's this term called total bureaucratization, and then on page 21, he kind of defines it a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and read on page 21 this passage here. Starts with, this was not just a political realignment, it was a cultural transformation, and it sets the stage for the process whereby the bureaucratic techniques, performance reviews, focus groups, time allocation surveys, No Child Left Behind, developed in financial and corporate circles, came to invade the rest of society, education, science, and government, and eventually to pervade almost every aspect of everyday life. So the systems by which the bureaucracy controls individuals, controls how things operate, which was set up in government circles, now begins to enter into other areas of our lives, in the financial sector, right? Try to talk to someone at the bank and try to have a problem solved. You go through kind of a maze of telemarketing to do that, and that these things called best practices begin to, as he said, invade all aspects of our lives. So to paraphrase all of that, the bureaucracy begins in big government, and it's done to manage resources and people. But that there was this area, or supposed to be this area outside the government where we could escape the bureaucracy, right, and live simple private lives. And so Graeber's point is there is no space now outside of bureaucracy where we can live. And so, and he argues that is bad, okay, because the bureaucrats don't have our best interests in mind. They have the interests of power and profit in mind, okay? So this era of total bureaucratization is a bad thing, and it's something that they don't want us to see. They don't want us to look behind the curtain. Okay, and so the rest of that passage is pretty good as well. So if you go to page 22, there's this other thing called credentialism, which is another key concept. Credentialism is the concept that describes how we have to jump through hoops to get anything in life, professionally, socially, civilly, whatever. So let's take a look at something like just learning how to drive a car. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, well, not 200 years ago, but let's say early 1900s, you buy a car, someone teaches you how to drive it, okay? Buggy, one of the first cars, right? There wasn't a whole system set up for this. There was just your dad, your grandfather putting you in the car. All right, this is how you do this. You turn the wheels, you press on the pedals, the whole thing. No driver's license, no anything like that. So then in the era of credentialism, every aspect of that is controlled now. And we take it for granted, right? In fact, we've probably been convinced that the best way of doing this is the way it is, which is, you're 15. I mean, it's even changed since I have a daughter who's just turning 15. I'm noting that it's a lot different even now. More bureaucratic, more rules, more laws, more things you have to do, more IDs you have to have, more tests you have to take before you get permission granted to you by the government to be able to drive the car. And in a lot of ways, the bureaucracy grows by preying upon what we fear, right? And so they say, well, if it's not this way, we're going to have all these crazy people driving, and there's going to be car wrecks everywhere, and it's going to be a big mess. But the bureaucracy will take care of us. It'll make sure that getting your driver's license is peppered with a variety of tests and procedures and evaluations, et cetera, et cetera. Working for a university has very much become a big bureaucratic kind of endeavor, where you don't just teach anymore. You have to make sure you please the dean of the school, the president of the school, the department chair. You have all these eyes looking at you, making sure that you're doing everything the right way. And it's not any longer a place of creative disruption and intellectual discussion. It's more of a surveilled kind of place where we have to make sure that that the teacher's saying the right kinds of things in the right kinds of ways. That would be also part of what Graeber would say is the era of total bureaucratization. The classroom has become bureaucratized, okay? And he talks a little bit more about that in the end of the second essay about how it ultimately kills creativity and intellectual thought. And that's the whole point. Okay, so that's credentialism. Credentialism is part of the process of controlling lives, and making sure that before you can do anything, you have to have the right credentials to do that. Where are your papers? Show me your ID, right? The IDs that you guys carried around in high school, right? Okay, so a nice little bit on page 24 discusses the corporatization of education. Corporatization read bureaucratization. The corporatization of education, the resulting ballooning of tuitions as students are expected to pay for giant football stadiums and similar pet projects of executive trustees, or to contribute to the burgeoning salaries of ever-multiplying university officials, while the faculty salaries stay the same, by the way. Professors don't make a ton of money, by the way. Or to contribute to the burgeoning salaries of university administrators, the increasing demands for degrees as certificates of entry into any job that promises access to anything like a middle-class standard of living, resulting rising levels of indebtedness. All these form a single web. One result of all this debt is to render the government itself the main mechanism for the extraction of corporate profits. Just think here of what happens if one tries to default on one's student loans. The entire legal apparatus leaps into action, threatening to seize assets, garnish wages, and apply thousands of dollars in additional penalties. Okay, so the idea here is to show how bureaucratization kind of reaches into the educational system, and by that kind of snaring all people who kind of go that path. Okay, let's look at some more passages. I'm going to jump ahead to page 30. Here we're talking about in this, and I'm not going to read this entire passage here, but this is a really good rundown of how what we call free trade and the free market is actually a pseudonym now for a massive administrative bureaucratic system. So that before, when in the introduction of the essay, he talks about how the free market is supposed to keep us free of massive bureaucratic apparatus. It's actually the opposite. And part of the answer to that is discussed on page 30. Excuse me. Okay. In fact, he says on page 31, I love this line, bottom of 31, whenever someone starts talking about the free market, it's a good idea to look around for the man with the gun. What? What does that mean? We'll talk about that a little bit later in the second essay when he discusses structural violence. Great passage on the bottom, page 34. The bureaucratization of daily life means, bottom page 32. The bureaucratization of daily life means the imposition of impersonal rules and regulations. Impersonal rules and regulations, in turn, can only operate if they are backed up with the threat of force. And indeed, in this most recent phase of total bureaucratization, we've seen security cameras, police scooters, issuers of temporary ID cards, and men and women in a variety of uniforms acting in either public or private capacities, trained in tactics of menacing, intimidating, and ultimately deploying physical violence. Appear just about everywhere, even in places such as playgrounds, primary schools, college campuses, hospitals, libraries, parks, or beach resorts. Okay? So again, the knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, we need to have all this, right? We need to have all this because it makes us safe. Because look at all these terrible things that are happening. Because we need to be protected, right? And the question is, do all these bureaucratic procedures protect us? And it makes me think about this is just off the cuff. all the issues surrounding data collection from our phones. I'm sure you've heard about this, and they store all this information in some big, massive warehouse in the middle of Utah, or is it Nevada? Anywhere, somewhere in the desert. They have recorded and kept all of our emails and the phone calls that we make, and who we talk to and what we say. All of that did not prevent the bombing in Boston. Having all that information doesn't seem to prevent anything from happening necessarily. But that's because it's not really about protecting us. It's about control and keeping information, because information is power. So, and so here we have, the argument being that bureaucratization is about control. Well, how do you control people? Surveil them and threaten them with violence. And he makes that, again, that connection even stronger in the second essay. Okay. So then the last, let's look at anything else with this essay here. That is kind of the main, I would say the main points with the first essay. Obviously, there are lots of other, passages there that you can look at, and that you can use in the paper. You don't have to use what I used. I'm trying to map out some of the main points here. So now I'd like to go to the second essay that you guys read, which is the first essay of the book, called Dead Zones of the Imagination, an essay on structural stupidity. Okay, and so in short, this essay is about how bureaucracy is set up to control individuals, and the result being we become kind of intellectually and creatively dead. And that is the whole point, that they don't want educated, creative individuals doing anything to disrupt the system. No, don't do that. They want cogs for the machine. They want employees, basically. And you want the employees to be creative to a certain degree, but mostly you want them to just do what they're told. You never want something to be so disruptive as to upset the current power structure. Okay. So let's go to where he outlines some of that. There's some really great stuff though on top of page 53. This is where he lists a whole bunch of writers. It would be really interesting to bring in, besides David Foster Wallace, to bring in folks like Kafka, Borges, an Italian writer named Calvino, a lot of good stuff there. This Russian sci-fi writer named Stanislaw Lem, Catch-22. He goes through a bunch of good stuff there. And a lot of what he's doing does rely on what they call a Marxist critique. So there's Marx in there. There's another guy named Foucault, Foucault, who also is a big philosopher who kind of exposes the underpinnings of power and how power works. So if you look at page 57, the paragraph at the bottom, he kind of gives us the thesis, I think. He says, but this essay is not just primarily about bureaucracy, it is primarily about violence. Okay, so how is violence linked to bureaucracy? What I would like to argue is that situations created by violence, particularly structural violence, which only means it's violence that is integrated and threaded through the society in legal ways, part of the structure of society. So he says, what I would like to argue is that situations created by violence, particularly structural violence, by which I mean forms of pervasive social inequality that are ultimately backed up by the threat of physical harm, invariably tend to create the kinds of willful blindness we normally associate with bureaucratic procedures. So one way to think of it is in terms of Hang on a second, I mapped it out. One of these pages. Well, what you have is you have the bureaucracy, which is enforced by violence, which leads to a kind of blind obedience, which forces us into a kind of emotionally, creatively, intellectually dead state, stupidity. You know, when a police officer asks you to get out of your car, see what happens if you try to debate the officer, right? I mean, we've seen these things. You get tased. I mean, there's a reason for this. The police officers are not encouraged, it seems, to, you know, my thing is police officers should be the best negotiators, the best at verbally persuading people to do things, right? Because they on a daily basis have to go about and get people to do the right thing. They don't seem to be very good at that, right? What they're really good at is shooting people and tasing them. So the opposite of what you would think is actually in play, and that's because we're not encouraged to have debates. Just obey. Just do your job, okay? Just do what you're told. And to be educated is actually to do the opposite. It's to creatively and sometimes respectfully refute and critique power and power systems. That's what education is supposed to be about. It's not what it is about anymore. That's what it's supposed to be about. And so the bureaucracy wants us to just kind of lie down and take it, or get tased. So that's at the bottom of 57. So this is called structural violence. Bottom of page 59 is a good definition of what structural violence is. You can take a look at that. So the essay, that's the main bit of the essay. You know, it's linking bureaucracy to violence, to how this affects us as individuals, and how it makes us, he calls it the dead zone of the imagination. Okay, so if you look at page 65, you know, explain the relation between violence, bureaucratic systems, and absurdity. Okay, it forces us into these absurd behaviors. There's also a whole thing about what he calls interpretive labor, and the main thing to understand there is that this is kind of a Marxist thing, but that our jobs are no longer about creative labor. Mostly our jobs are about doing this one thing really well, getting paid for it, so that someone above us makes a ton of money, usually the owners of capital. So the bureaucracy, again, does not want, the owner of a big corporation doesn't really care about your theories or ideas about things necessarily. They want a certain specific skill set, and they want you to do that really well. Sometimes that means you have to be creative in a certain way, but keep it there. That's what I'm paying you for. I don't want to see this creativity over here used in that way, right? It's channeling us into certain really specific ways to make money. Interpretive labor is kind of the opposite of that. It's about being able to use your ideas creatively to disrupt, to do things better, to recreate, to destroy sometimes. And so the bureaucrats, you know, prefer us to not be agents of interpretive labor. Page 73 goes into a whole thing about, I love this line, police are bureaucrats with weapons. And there you can see kind of a whole thing about how that works. Okay, oh, I love this passage. Page 80 answers the question, why is it that law-abiding citizens are under threat? All right, take a look at that. and he talks about the is this the where he talks about the guy selling cigarettes? It makes me think about that. The fellow who was on YouTube a while back. Someone videotaped this guy like on the corner selling cigarettes, and how it escalated to the point where multiple police officers were involved. Ending up, I think they killed the guy. This is like a law-abiding guy just kind of selling cigarettes, and how it escalates to the point where you're dead, right? This is a problem. Page 80 talks a little bit about that. Page 80, bottom 83, we're looking to see how violence encourages inequality and the separation of the rich from the poor, which leads to the death of the imagination, which leads to the dead zone of the imagination. Okay, that's the main thread through this essay. A lot of good stuff here. I'm just looking to see if there's any other big. On page 94, if you look at the paragraph to recall the argument so far, those are really good opportunities to figure out what the argument is. If you've been kind of trying to piece it together, he's summarizing the argument. If you look at page 95, so far I've proposed that. Another good opportunity to understand the argument there. Okay. I think I'm going to kind of let it sit there. I will point to pages 98 and 99 as also being pretty important as well, and maybe even connecting it to David Foster Wallace. Kind of give you a little tidbit there. So hopefully that at least gives you a framework or a map, as well as some specific passages to go to begin to make the connections to David Foster Wallace, and then to reach out to outside sources to pull in to your papers like you've done this entire semester pretty well. So that's all I have regarding those two essays. Please feel free to reach out to me via email, and I will try to help out from there. Regarding my knee, I have to have a procedure done, as it turns out. So, sorry that this turned into a virtual class. That was obviously not the intent, but that was the reality of it. So, have really missed being in class with you guys. This is not how I prefer to do a class at all. But I limped through it. We literally limped through it together. So, stay in touch, and then we'll keep taking it from there. All the grades are posted at this point, and that's all I really have to say. So I'm here if you have any questions. Thanks a lot for listening. Take care. Bye.